Do you know what the funniest thing about so many men is nowadays? So many men are no longer scared of being single. They're now scared of being in a soul-sucking, detrimental relationship that's only going to waste their time, waste their energy, waste their effort, and waste their money. They would rather be single than be in a bad relationship. So it's not that men are complaining because they're single. Men are complaining because they've just seen everything as such a waste of time for them lately.
There is a quiet shift happening right now that most people are not ready to talk about. And it is not loud, it is not dramatic, and it is not announced with headlines and breaking news banners. It is something unfolding in the background of everyday life, in the spaces between conversations, in the absence of things that used to happen automatically. What makes it unsettling is not what is being said, but what is no longer happening at all. By the end of this video, you will understand why so many people are confused, why some are panicking, and why others are finally at peace. Before we get into it, make sure you like the video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and click the notification bell, and select all if you want more Angry Guy content and want every single video the moment we release it. It helps the channel more than you realize, and it keeps these conversations going. Also, if you want to protect and safeguard your assets and grow your wealth, check out Angry's Crypto Academy. It is linked in the description of the video, and it teaches you how to buy, sell, and trade crypto responsibly while understanding the broader financial landscape that is shaping the world right now. If you are enjoying these Angry Guy videos and want to show support, you can also buy me a Red Bull using the link in the description. Every bit of support helps keep this channel independent and focused. Now, let us talk about what is really happening. Across social media platforms, especially short form video, a pattern has emerged that is difficult to ignore once you see it. Videos appear daily of people speaking directly into a camera, expressing confusion, frustration, exhaustion, and financial stress. Many of these videos revolve around the same themes: rising costs, shrinking options, a sense that the social contract they believed in is no longer functioning the way it once did. And beneath all of it, a recurring question that keeps surfacing in different forms: what changed? At the same time, something else is happening that rarely gets discussed openly. Large numbers of men are disengaging, not loudly, not angrily, not with protests or slogans. They are simply opting out. They are not approaching. They are not initiating. They are not competing. They are not playing roles that once felt mandatory. And because this shift is quiet, many people do not notice it until its effects start showing up everywhere. For decades, men were taught a very specific story about their place in society. The message was consistent across media, family expectations, and cultural norms. Be useful, be dependable, provide stability, absorb stress, do not complain. Prove your value through output, sacrifice, and endurance. Love, companionship, and acceptance were often framed as rewards for fulfilling those expectations. Over time, many men internalized the idea that self worth came primarily from what they could give rather than who they were. What changed was not a single event, it was accumulation. Over years, messages began to shift. Traditional roles were questioned, which is not inherently a problem. Reevaluating outdated structures can be healthy. But alongside that reevaluation came something else: a growing narrative that framed men less as partners and more as problems to be managed. Masculinity was often discussed only in its worst expressions. Male ambition became suspect. Male boundaries were interpreted as selfishness. Male withdrawal was framed as failure. At the same time, men were told that they were no longer needed in the ways they had been before. That independence meant separation rather than cooperation. That asking for support was weakness. That speaking openly about frustration was entitlement. Many men listened. They adapted. They stepped back. They tried to follow the rules as they were presented. What no one anticipated was what would happen when men took those messages seriously. When people are repeatedly told to step aside, eventually they do. When they are told their presence is optional, eventually they remove it. When they are told their value is conditional and constantly questioned, Eventually, they stop offering it freely. This is not rebellion, it is pattern recognition. For many men, there was a moment where things quietly clicked into place. A realization that being alone is not the same as feeling isolated. That peace can exist without constant negotiation. That simplicity can be more valuable than status. That reducing obligations can increase freedom. That life does not have to be a performance evaluated by others. Once that realization happens, something changes internally. The urgency disappears, the anxiety fades, the need to impress evaporates. Men begin to build lives around what actually brings them stability and calm rather than what earns external approval. This is why the disengagement looks invisible. There is no crisis moment, there is no dramatic exit. Men simply stop showing up where they no longer feel welcome or respected. They stop initiating conversations that feel transactional. They stop competing in systems that feel stacked against them. They stop chasing validation that never arrives. Meanwhile, society continues operating on outdated assumptions. Assumptions that men will always pursue, that men will always provide, that men will always absorb pressure silently, that men will always return no matter how often they are told to leave. Those assumptions are no longer holding. The economic environment amplifies the shift. Rising costs, stagnant wages, and shrinking margins have forced everyone to reassess priorities. When resources become limited, people stop investing them where returns feel uncertain or one sided. Time, attention, and money are not infinite. When men begin viewing them as finite resources rather than obligations, behavior changes naturally. This is why so many conversations online feel misaligned. One group is asking why things are harder than expected. Another group has quietly adjusted expectations downward and found relief. One group is demanding a return to old norms. Another has already moved on. None of this is about hostility. It is about boundaries. Men who disengage are not doing so out of bitterness. Most are not angry. Many are calmer than they have ever been. They are no longer trying to fix systems they did not design. They are no longer attempting to meet moving targets. They are no longer internalizing blame for outcomes they cannot control. They are choosing predictability over chaos, peace over pressure, solitude over constant evaluation. And for many, that choice feels like relief. This shift also exposes something uncomfortable about how support structures were imagined. For years, there was an assumption that institutions would replace interpersonal reliance, that systems would catch people if traditional dynamics dissolved. That financial stability would be guaranteed through policy rather than partnership. But systems are impersonal, slow, and finite. When economic strain increases, those systems tighten. Promises become conditional. Safety nets fray. At that point, people look around and realize that informal support networks mattered more than they thought. That cooperation required mutual respect. That independence without infrastructure is fragile. Men, having already reduced expectations, adapt faster. Minimalism becomes to an advantage. Smaller living spaces, fewer dependencies, lower emotional overhead, a willingness to walk away from anything that threatens stability. When you need less, you are less vulnerable to disruption. This is not about superiority, it is about adaptation. There is a reason so many men report feeling better after disengaging. Stress decreases when obligations decrease. Anxiety fades when expectations are self defined. Confidence grows when approval is internal rather than external. Life becomes quieter, but also clearer. The confusion arises because society rarely prepares people for this outcome. The assumption was always that men would remain the constant variable, that no matter how dynamics shifted, men would adjust endlessly without withdrawing. That assumption underestimated the power of quiet refusal. What we are witnessing is not collapse in the dramatic sense, it is reallocation. Energy moving away from spaces that feel draining and toward spaces that feel sustainable. Attention flowing toward personal development rather than external validation. Time being spent on health, skills, finances, and peace. Hey guys, in a world pushing you to own nothing and be happy, crypto is your key to survival. Join Angry's Crypto Academy to master buying, selling, and trading crypto. Make huge profits and safeguard your wealth. Plus, discover the one crypto virtually no one is talking about, poised to create new millionaires in the upcoming bull run. The link is in the description of the video below. Go check it out now. When viewed through this lens, the panic some express is not about invisibility. It is about unpredictability. When a group that was once reliable becomes optional, systems built on their reliability wobble. Expectations lag behind reality. Confusion sets in. The uncomfortable truth is that no one is owed participation. Cooperation only works when it benefits all involved. When that balance feels lost, disengagement becomes rational. This does not mean relationships are impossible. It means they are no longer assumed. They must be mutually beneficial, respectful, and grounded in reality rather than roles. Anything less will increasingly be ignored. As economic pressure continues, these trends will likely accelerate. People will prioritize what works. Narratives will adjust slowly. Some will adapt. Others will cling to outdated expectations. The gap between assumption and reality will widen before it closes. What matters now is understanding what is actually happening rather than reacting emotionally to surface level symptoms. This is not a war. It is not a punishment. It is not a scheme. It is the predictable result of incentives changing over time. Men did not disappear. They simply stopped overextending themselves. They stopped filling gaps that were never theirs to fill alone. They stopped confusing obligation with connection. And once that line is drawn internally, it is rarely crossed again. To understand why this moment feels so disorienting to so many people, you have to look backward before you can clearly see forward. Cultural shifts never happen overnight. They unfold gradually, layered one decision, one narrative, one incentive at a time, until the accumulated weight changes behavior in ways no single group planned for. What we are seeing now is not a sudden disappearance of effort or engagement. It is the delayed consequence of decades of messaging colliding with economic reality. For a long time, men were encouraged to redefine themselves without being given a clear alternative framework. Traditional expectations were criticized, sometimes rightly, but nothing stable replaced them. The message often boiled down to this: do less of what you were taught, but still produce the same outcomes. Give without expecting reciprocity. Adapt endlessly without resistance. Accept criticism without context. Over time, that creates exhaustion rather than progress. When people feel that their contributions are assumed rather than appreciated, motivation erodes. When effort is framed as obligation instead of choice, it becomes unsustainable. Men were told repeatedly that they should change, but rarely told what they were changing toward other than vague ideals that shifted depending on the moment. That uncertainty alone causes many people to disengage because no one wants to operate in a system where the rules are unclear and constantly moving. At the same time, public discourse increasingly rewarded visibility over substance. Loud opinions traveled faster than thoughtful ones. Simplified narratives replaced nuanced discussion. Social media platforms amplified extremes because extremes generate engagement. This environment created the illusion that certain views were universal, when in reality they were simply louder. Many men absorbed those messages quietly, assumed they reflected consensus, and adjusted their behavior accordingly. One of the most significant shifts was the redefinition of approach and initiative. Men were told that initiating conversations, expressing interest, or even existing confidently in public spaces could be interpreted negatively. While the intention behind some of these messages was to encourage respect, the delivery often lacked balance. It created uncertainty rather than clarity. When people are unsure whether normal social behavior will be interpreted as inappropriate, many choose silence as the safest option. Silence, once chosen, becomes habit. Habit becomes identity. Over time, disengagement stops feeling like avoidance and starts feeling like preference. Another overlooked factor is how modern economic pressure reshapes personal priorities. When survival feels uncertain, people become more conservative with their resources. This is true financially, emotionally, and socially. Men who once invested heavily in dating, socializing, and external validation began asking practical questions. What is the return on this investment? What does this cost me long term? Does this align with the life I actually want? As costs increased and outcomes became less predictable, many decided the equation no longer made sense. This was not a collective decision or a coordinated movement. It was millions of individual calculations happening independently, all pointing in the same direction. This is why attempts to shame or pressure men back into old roles have largely failed. Shame only works when people value the approval of the group doing the shaming. Once men stop seeking that approval, the leverage disappears. Criticism loses its power when it no longer threatens identity. Instead, what replaced the old framework for many men was simplicity, not in an ideological sense, but in a practical one. Fewer obligations, clear boundaries, smaller circles, direct goals, predictable routines. Peace became the metric rather than status. This shift also changed how men view relationships. Instead of seeing them as milestones or markers of success, they are now evaluated based on impact. Does this add stability or stress? Does this support growth or drain energy? Is this reciprocal or one sided? Relationships that fail these tests are quietly declined rather than argued over. This is deeply unsettling for systems that relied on automatic participation. When engagement becomes selective, scarcity emerges where abundance was assumed. Attention is no longer freely given. Effort must be earned. Stability requires cooperation rather than expectation. The panic some people feel is not about rejection in the personal sense, it is about losing predictability. When you build expectations around a group behaving a certain way indefinitely, any deviation feels like betrayal, even if no promise was ever made. Men are often accused of abandoning responsibility, but what responsibility actually means has become unclear. Responsibility to whom? Responsibility for what? Responsibility under what conditions? Without clear answers, responsibility becomes a burden rather than a virtue. Many men reached a point where they asked a simple question. If I am constantly told I am unnecessary, why am I expected to remain indispensable? That question does not come from resentment, it comes from logic. Another important aspect of the shift is how men perceive time. When younger, time feels abundant, sacrifice feels temporary, endurance feels noble. As men age and experience repeated cycles of effort without reward, perspective changes, time becomes precious, energy becomes finite, peace becomes valuable. At that stage, people stop investing in uncertain outcomes. This is why so many men describe a sense of calm after disengaging. They are no longer waiting for approval that may never come. They are no longer negotiating their worth. They are no longer absorbing stress they did not create. Critically, this does not mean men have stopped caring. It means they have become more selective about where they care. Selectivity is often mistaken for apathy by those who benefited from indiscriminate effort. The cultural conversation often misses this distinction. Disengagement is framed as hostility rather than self preservation. Withdrawal is labeled bitterness rather than boundary setting. But when you listen to men describe their experiences, the language they use is not angry, it is relieved. Relief is a powerful indicator. People do not feel relieved when they are acting against their own interests. They feel relieved when pressure lifts, when conflict ends, when expectations align with reality. This is why simplistic explanations fail. This is not about one gender versus another. It is about incentives, expectations, and sustainability. When a system becomes unsustainable, people adapt or exit. Men are adapting by exiting roles that no longer function. Another layer to consider is how technology mediates relationships. Online platforms have transformed how people interact, evaluate, and replace one another. Abundance of options creates paradoxical scarcity of commitment. When everything feels replaceable, nothing feels essential. Men watching this dynamic unfold learned an important lesson. Investment in unstable environments is risky. Rather than competing in increasingly performative spaces, many chose to opt out entirely. Offline life became more appealing. Quiet routines replaced constant engagement. The absence of drama became a feature rather than a flaw. This shift also exposes a deeper misunderstanding about motivation. Men were often motivated by being needed. When that need was publicly dismissed, motivation declined. Purpose cannot be commanded, it must be felt. You cannot tell people they are irrelevant and then demand relevance from them when circumstances change. Purpose does not work on demand. As financial systems tighten and social safety nets strain, this reality becomes harder to ignore. Independence is celebrated until interdependence is required. At that moment, cooperation must be rebuilt on new terms, not assumed on old ones. Men who have already adjusted are less affected by this transition. They have already simplified, already lowered expectations, already built self sufficiency. Those who relied on continuity feel the shock more intensely. This difference in preparedness explains the emotional gap visible online. One group is scrambling to recalibrate, another has already moved on. The most misunderstood aspect of all this is that men are not organizing around ideology. There is no manifesto, no leader, no centralized message. That is precisely why it is so difficult to counter. It is emergent behavior driven by incentives rather than rhetoric. When incentives change, behavior follows. When behavior changes at scale, culture shifts. This process cannot be reversed by slogans or shaming, only by addressing underlying conditions, and that requires honesty. Honest conversations about expectations, honest discussions about reciprocity, honest acknowledgement of how policies, narratives, and economic pressures intersect. Without that honesty, efforts to re engage will continue to fail. What comes next is uncertain. Some dynamics may rebalance naturally, others may calcify. But one thing is clear: the era of automatic participation is ending. Engagement will be intentional or it will not happen at all. Men have discovered that walking away does not mean falling behind. In many cases, it means catching up with themselves, rediscovering hobbies, health, skills, and peace that were neglected under constant pressure. This does not make them villains, it makes them human. As the world becomes more volatile, people will continue choosing stability over chaos. Any system that ignores this reality will struggle. Any conversation that refuses to acknowledge it will remain stuck. The question is not whether men will return to old roles. The question is whether new balanced frameworks can emerge that respect autonomy while encouraging cooperation. That requires mutual effort, not assumption. When people attempt to understand a large social shift, they often focus on surface behavior rather than underlying causes. They look at outcomes and argue over who is at fault instead of asking why incentives changed in the first place. This is where much of the public conversation breaks down. It treats disengagement as a moral failure rather than a rational response to long term conditions. When behavior changes at scale, it is rarely because millions of people suddenly decided to behave badly. It is because the environment rewarded a different choice. For years, men were encouraged to be flexible, adaptable, and resilient. Those traits became survival tools rather than virtues. Flexibility turned into constant adjustment. Adaptability turned into erasing boundaries. Resilience turned into tolerating situations that offered diminishing returns. Eventually, resilience stops being strength and starts becoming self neglect. At that point, withdrawal becomes the healthiest option available. What complicates this conversation is that the shift did not affect everyone equally or at the same pace. Some men disengaged early after repeated negative experiences. Others held on longer, hoping things would stabilize or rebalance. But as economic pressure increased and social narratives hardened, even those who were optimistic began reevaluating their position. When effort does not lead to stability, people stop offering effort. A key misunderstanding is the belief that men disengaged because they stopped wanting connection. That is not accurate. Most men still value connection deeply. What changed was their willingness to pursue it under conditions that felt unpredictable or asymmetrical. Wanting connection does not obligate someone to accept instability. Wanting companionship does not require enduring constant stress. The distinction between desire and tolerance matters. Men did not stop wanting meaningful relationships. They stopped tolerating systems that made meaningful relationships harder rather than easier. When the cost of participation outweighs the benefits, opting out is not avoidance, it is discernment. There's also a generational component that often goes unspoken. Younger men grew up watching older men navigate systems that seemed stacked against them. They observed the outcomes rather than the intentions. They saw long work hours paired with limited appreciation. They saw emotional labor expected but rarely reciprocated. They saw financial risk concentrated on one side. These observations shaped expectations early. As a result, many younger men decided preemptively not to overextend themselves. This is not cynicism, it is learning. When people learn from others' experiences, they often choose safer paths. The safer path, in this case, was lower exposure to risk. Another important factor is how conflict resolution changed. In previous eras, interpersonal conflict was handled privately or within communities. Today, conflict is often externalized, recorded, and amplified. The possibility that misunderstandings could escalate publicly has made many people more cautious. For men, this caution often manifests as avoidance. When the potential cost of misinterpretation feels high, disengagement becomes the safest response. This environment does not encourage organic connection, it encourages distance. Over time, distance normalizes. Once distance becomes normal, returning to closeness feels unnecessary rather than desirable. Attempts to reverse these patterns through messaging alone have largely failed because they do not address the lived experiences that shape them. Telling men to re engage without changing conditions is like telling people to invest in a market that consistently produces losses. Without structural changes, persuasion falls flat. Nostalgia is often used as a substitute for strategy. People reference past norms without acknowledging the conditions that made them possible. Those conditions included economic stability, clear social expectations, and shared responsibility. Removing those foundations while expecting the same outcomes is unrealistic. Another overlooked aspect is the role of self respect. Men who disengage often describe a renewed sense of self respect. This does not come from dominance or superiority, It comes from alignment, living in a way that feels internally consistent, saying no when something feels wrong, choosing peace over approval. Self respect grows when actions align with values. If a system consistently pressures people to compromise their values, leaving that system strengthens identity rather than weakens it. This is why labeling disengaged men as lost or broken misses the point. Many report feeling more grounded, healthier, and more focused than before. They sleep better. They manage finances more conservatively. They invest time in skills and routines that produce tangible results. When viewed objectively, these are signs of adaptation, not failure. The question that follows is whether society can recalibrate expectations to meet this new reality. That requires acknowledging that automatic participation is gone. Cooperation must be voluntary and mutually beneficial. Stability cannot be demanded, it must be built. This recalibration is uncomfortable because it removes leverage that was once taken for granted. It requires accountability across systems rather than reliance on one group to absorb pressure. It requires conversations that move beyond blame and into responsibility. Responsibility, however, must be clearly defined. Vague expectations lead to frustration. Clear boundaries enable cooperation. Without clarity, people default to self preservation. Another layer worth examining is how success is defined. For a long time, success for men was measured externally: career status, income, relationship milestones. As these markers became harder to achieve or less rewarding, men redefined success internally: peace, autonomy, predictability, health. When success becomes internal, external pressure loses influence. People stop chasing symbols and start prioritizing substance. This shift is irreversible once it occurs. This also explains why shaming tactics fail. Shame relies on shared values. When values change, shame becomes noise. Men who no longer measure worth by external approval are unaffected by criticism aimed at those metrics. What we are witnessing is a divergence in value systems. Some continue operating under older frameworks, others have moved on. Conflict arises when one group expects the other to conform to standards they no longer recognize. Understanding this divergence is crucial for any meaningful dialogue. Without it, conversations remain circular and unproductive. There is also a psychological component that deserves attention. Chronic stress narrows focus. When men were constantly navigating uncertainty, stress became normalized. Removing sources of stress revealed how heavy the load had been. That realization reinforces the choice to disengage. People rarely return voluntarily to environments that made them feel worse once they experience relief. This is why attempts to guilt men back into old roles feel hollow. Relief is a powerful motivator to stay away. It is also important to note that disengagement does not mean isolation. Many men build strong friendships, communities, and support networks outside traditional frameworks. These connections are often quieter, smaller, and more stable. They prioritize trust over performance. This challenges the assumption that withdrawal leads to loneliness. In many cases, it leads to more authentic connection because expectations are clearer and stakes are lower. The broader implication is that future systems must account for autonomy. Any framework that assumes obligation without consent will struggle. Cooperation must be chosen, not enforced. As economic and social pressures continue evolving, adaptability will matter more than ideology. Systems that adjust to incentives will survive. Those that cling to outdated assumptions will fracture. Men walking away is not the cause of instability, it is a response to it. Addressing the response without addressing the cause guarantees failure. The path forward, if one exists, requires honesty about trade offs. It requires acknowledging that independence and cooperation are not opposites but balances. It requires respecting boundaries rather than dismissing them. Whether that balance is achieved remains uncertain. What is certain is that the old model is not coming back unchanged. Too many people have seen behind the curtain. Too many have experienced relief after stepping away. As the shift continues, more people will face a choice: adapt expectations or cling to frustration, build new frameworks or mourn old ones, accept autonomy or resist it. Men have already made their choice quietly. Others will have to decide how to respond. As this shift continues to unfold, one of the most revealing aspects is how strongly some people resist acknowledging it. Resistance often appears as denial at first, followed by frustration, and eventually by attempts to explain the change away as temporary or artificial. This reaction is understandable. When long standing assumptions stop working, it feels destabilizing. But denial does not reverse incentives, it only delays adjustment. For many years, social stability relied on predictability. People made long term plans based on the assumption that certain behaviors would remain consistent. Men would pursue, men would provide, men would absorb risk. Those assumptions shaped everything from housing markets to lifestyle expectations. When that predictability weakens, downstream effects appear everywhere. What makes the current moment different from past adjustments is the speed at which information spreads. Men can now compare experiences instantly across geography and culture. Patterns that once took decades to notice become obvious within months. When men realize their experiences are not isolated, but shared by millions, internal narratives shift rapidly. This shared awareness does not require coordination. It emerges naturally when people compare outcomes and notice similarities. Recognition replaces confusion. Confusion once kept people engaged longer than they should have been. Recognition accelerates exit. Another factor accelerating disengagement is the growing emphasis on risk management. In uncertain environments, people become conservative. They reduce exposure. They avoid situations where consequences are unpredictable or asymmetric. This is basic human behavior, not ideology. Men increasingly view many social dynamics through a risk lens rather than a romantic or idealistic one. This does not mean they lack emotion. It means experience taught them caution. When risk outweighs reward consistently, disengagement becomes prudent. This recalibration also affects how men interpret advice. Generic encouragement to participate rings hollow when it ignores lived experience. Advice divorced from reality loses credibility quickly. Men trust what they observe, not what they are told. This shift toward observable reality over narrative is significant. It marks a move away from abstract ideals toward concrete outcomes. When people prioritize results, systems must deliver value to retain participants. Sentiment alone is insufficient. The conversation often becomes emotionally charged because people interpret disengagement personally. They assume it reflects rejection or hostility. In reality, most disengaged men are not reacting to individuals. They are responding to systems. Systems that feel misaligned with their values and interests. This distinction matters because you cannot fix systemic disengagement with personal appeals. Appeals may work short term for some, but without systemic change, patterns reassert themselves. One of the clearest indicators of systemic issues is how often men describe relief rather than anger. Relief suggests escape from pressure, not desire for conflict. People do not feel relieved when they are abandoning something valuable. They feel relieved when they are leaving something burdensome. This challenges the narrative that disengagement is destructive. For the individuals involved, it is often constructive. It allows focus to shift towards self maintenance and growth. Another important observation is how expectations around contribution have become lopsided. Contribution is often discussed as obligation rather than exchange. When contribution lacks reciprocity, it feels extractive. People eventually stop participating in extractive systems, and men who disengage often cite feeling valued only for output. When appreciation disappears and criticism increases, motivation collapses. Value without respect is unsustainable. Respect does not mean agreement, it means acknowledgement of effort and boundaries. When respect is absent, people protect themselves by withdrawing. The idea that men should remain engaged regardless of conditions assumes infinite capacity. In reality, capacity is limited. Emotional bandwidth, financial resources, and time all have limits. Once those limits are reached, withdrawal becomes necessary. This is especially true as economic uncertainty increases. When future stability is unclear, people focus on what they can control. They reduce variables. They simplify lives. They choose certainty over aspiration. And this simplification often looks like minimalism from the outside. Smaller spaces, fewer commitments, tighter routines. But for those living it, it feels like clarity. Removing unnecessary complexity frees mental space. Complexity is often mistaken for richness. In reality, excessive complexity increases stress. Men who disengage frequently report that life becomes quieter, but also more manageable. This quietness unsettles those who equate visibility with engagement. Quiet participation looks like absence, but absence from noise does not equal absence from life. Another element worth exploring is how expectations were internalized differently across groups. Men were often taught that their worth was tied to endurance, that enduring discomfort was virtuous, that walking away was weakness. Breaking from that conditioning requires reframing self worth. Once men stop equating endurance with virtue, many reassess past sacrifices. They ask whether suffering was truly necessary or simply expected. This reassessment often leads to anger briefly, followed by acceptance. Acceptance is the final stage of disengagement. It is where resentment fades and peace settles in. At that point, attempts to provoke reaction fail. The person has moved on emotionally. This emotional detachment is often misinterpreted as apathy. In reality, it is closure. From a societal perspective, closure at scale creates adjustment challenges. Systems must adapt to reduce participation. Roles once filled automatically must be reimagined. Expectations must be renegotiated. The challenge is that renegotiation requires humility. It requires admitting that past assumptions no longer apply. Many institutions resist this because it threatens authority and identity. However, reality does not negotiate, it enforces. As disengagement becomes more normalized, cultural narratives will eventually adjust. New stories will emerge to explain the shift. Some will be accurate, others will be defensive. Over time, only those aligned with lived experience will persist. This is how cultural evolution works. Ideas compete, outcomes decide. It is important to recognize that disengagement does not mean disengagement forever. It means disengagement under current conditions. If conditions change, behavior may change, but change must be substantive, not cosmetic. Men will not re engage because they are told to. They will re engage when participation feels worthwhile, respected, and stable. That requires rebuilding trust. Trust is slow to build and quick to erode. Once broken at scale, it takes time and consistency to restore. Trust cannot be demanded, it must be earned through action. Another misunderstanding is that disengaged men are isolated from society. Many remain productive, employed, and civically engaged in selective ways. They simply choose how and where to invest. This selectivity is the defining characteristic of the shift. Automatic participation has been replaced by intentional participation. Intentional participation changes power dynamics. It removes entitlement. It forces negotiation. It creates accountability. This can be healthy long term, but only if systems adapt rather than resist. Resistance manifests as attempts to shame, guilt, or coerce participation. These tactics backfire because they reinforce the reasons for disengagement. Coercion confirms that autonomy is not respected. Respecting autonomy is the first step toward cooperation. Ignoring it guarantees continued withdrawal. As more men disengage, those who remain engaged may feel increased pressure. They may be asked to fill gaps. They may be praised as examples. This can create resentment if pressure becomes excessive. Eventually, even those men may reassess. Disengagement often spreads not through persuasion, but through observation. People notice who appears calmer, healthier, and more stable. Stability is attractive, chaos repels. This is why narratives that portray disengaged men as failures struggle to gain traction. Observable reality contradicts them. When people see peace rather than collapse, fear based messaging loses credibility. The future will likely involve a prolonged adjustment period. Expectations will lag behind behavior. Friction will increase before balance is restored. During this period, clarity matters. Understanding why people disengage helps reduce conflict. Misunderstanding fuels resentment. The most productive conversations moving forward will focus on incentives rather than morality. What encourages participation? What discourages it? What creates stability? Morality without incentive is ineffective. Incentive without morality is unstable. Balance requires both. As this balance is renegotiated, everyone will need to adapt, not just men. Systems that relied on automatic contribution will need redesign. Support structures will need reinforcement. Narratives will need updating. This process will be uncomfortable, but discomfort is not catastrophe. It is transition. Men walking away is not an ending, it is a signal that something was unsustainable. Ignoring signals leads to collapse. Responding to them leads to adaptation. When people talk about adaptation, they often imagine dramatic reforms or sweeping cultural resets, but real adaptation rarely looks like that. More often, it happens quietly, unevenly, and without coordination. Individuals adjust first. Institutions lag behind. Narratives follow last. We are still in the early stages of this process, which is why so much of the public discussion feels disjointed and emotionally charged. One of the reasons adaptation has been slow at the institutional level is that many systems were built on assumptions that no longer hold. These assumptions were never written down, but they shaped everything. That men would always step forward, that they would absorb financial and emotional strain, that they would tolerate imbalance in exchange for belonging. When those assumptions break, systems designed around them struggle to function as intended. This creates a feedback loop. Institutions apply pressure to restore old patterns. Individuals respond by disengaging further. Pressure increases, participation decreases. The loop continues until something gives. Either expectations change or participation erodes to the point where the system must be redesigned. What makes this moment particularly complex is that disengagement is not evenly distributed. Some men disengage fully, others partially. Some remain engaged in certain areas while withdrawing from others. This creates confusion because there is no single pattern to point to. But when you zoom out, the direction is clear. Participation is becoming conditional rather than assumed. Conditional participation requires negotiation. Negotiation requires mutual recognition. Mutual recognition requires respect. Without respect, negotiation fails before it begins. Respect, in this context, does not mean agreement on every issue. It means acknowledging autonomy, boundaries, and lived experience. Many men disengaged because they felt those things were dismissed. Rebuilding engagement requires reversing that dismissal. Another challenge is that many people mistake silence for absence of thought. When men stop participating in public debates, it is often assumed they have nothing to say. In reality, many are thinking deeply but see little value in speaking where their input feels unwelcome or inconsequential. Silence becomes a form of self selection rather than disengagement from thought. This selective silence has consequences. When one group stops contributing to conversations, the remaining discourse becomes skewed, perspectives narrow, solutions become less robust. Over time, this leads to policies and norms that fail to account for a significant portion of the population. The irony is that disengagement often occurs precisely because men care about outcomes. They stop participating when they believe participation no longer influences results. When effort feels disconnected from impact, motivation collapses. This is a fundamental principle of human behavior. People invest where they believe effort matters. When that belief erodes, withdrawal follows naturally. Attempts to reverse this through symbolic gestures or superficial messaging fail because they do not restore the connection between effort and outcome. Men are not looking for reassurance. They are looking for evidence. Evidence comes from consistent behavior over time, from systems that reward contribution fairly, from clear rules applied evenly, from accountability that flows in all directions. Without these elements, engagement remains low regardless of rhetoric. Another important aspect is how disengagement reshapes identity. Many men were socialized to define themselves through service. When that service is withdrawn, identity must be reconstructed. This can be disorienting initially, but it often leads to a more grounded sense of self. Men who rebuild identity around internal values rather than external roles tend to become less reactive. They are harder to manipulate through guilt or praise. They are more resistant to social pressure. This independence can be unsettling for systems that rely on predictability. Predictability, however, is not the same as stability. Stability requires resilience. Resilience requires flexibility at the system level, not just the individual level. As more men disengage, systems that fail to adapt will experience strain. This strain may appear as labor shortages, declining participation in certain social rituals, or increasing difficulty mobilizing collective effort. These symptoms are often misdiagnosed because the underlying cause is not acknowledged. Rather than asking why men are disengaging, discussions often focus on why they should not. This reversal of causality prevents resolution. Understanding causality requires uncomfortable honesty. It requires examining how incentives were structured, how narratives evolved, how accountability shifted. Without this examination, solutions remain superficial. Another factor that complicates adaptation is fear. Fear of losing status, fear of losing control, fear of admitting mistakes. Fear often drives resistance to change more than disagreement does. When fear dominates, conversations become defensive. Defensive conversations rarely produce insight, they produce blame. Blame, however, does not restore participation, it accelerates withdrawal. Men who disengage often describe a sense of clarity that emerges once blame is removed from their lives. They stop trying to prove innocence. They stop defending their intentions. They focus instead on what they can control. Control becomes a central theme. In uncertain environments, people seek control wherever possible. For men, disengagement restores a sense of agency. They decide how to spend time, money, and energy without constant negotiation. This regained agency is difficult to surrender once experienced. Any system seeking re engagement must offer agency rather than remove it. Agency does not mean absence of responsibility, it means responsibility chosen rather than imposed. There is a subtle but important difference between obligation and choice. Obligation breeds resentment. Choice fosters commitment. Many men disengaged because participation felt obligatory rather than chosen. Reframing participation as choice is essential for future cooperation. This reframing requires changing how contribution is discussed. Contribution must be recognized as voluntary and valuable, not expected and invisible. Recognition does not mean praise, it means acknowledgement. Acknowledgement validates effort. Without it, effort feels futile. Another element worth examining is how success stories are framed. Often, engaged men are held up as examples without acknowledging the costs they bear. This selective framing creates unrealistic expectations and resentment. Like, when people see only the rewards and not the sacrifices, trust erodes. Transparency is necessary to maintain credibility. Men who disengage often cite honesty as a missing element. Honest discussions about trade offs, risks, and limits are rare. Instead, idealized narratives dominate. Idealized narratives collapse under pressure. Reality asserts itself. As pressure increases globally, these dynamics will become more pronounced. Economic volatility, technological disruption, and demographic shifts all amplify the need for sustainable participation models. Sustainability requires balance. Balance requires feedback. Feedback requires listening. Listening becomes difficult when narratives are entrenched. But without listening, adaptation stalls. Men walking away is feedback. It is not a verdict, it is information. And ignoring information does not eliminate it, it compounds consequences. The longer systems delay adaptation, the more disruptive adjustment becomes. Gradual change is easier than forced change. Voluntary cooperation is more stable than coerced participation. The challenge ahead is whether enough people recognize this in time to recalibrate peacefully. History suggests adaptation often follows crisis rather than foresight. However, awareness is growing. Conversations that were once fringe are becoming mainstream. Quiet disengagement is becoming visible. Visibility changes dynamics. Once acknowledged, disengagement can be addressed constructively. Denial becomes harder to sustain. The path forward requires humility. It requires admitting that some assumptions were wrong, that some narratives overshot reality, that some systems relied too heavily on unpaid or unrecognized effort. Humility is uncomfortable, but it is necessary. Men who disengaged are not waiting for apologies. They are waiting for conditions to change, for incentives to align, for participation to make sense again. Until then, disengagement remains rational. As everything discussed so far comes together, one truth becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. What we are witnessing is not a temporary mood shift or a social media trend that will fade with time. It is a structural change in how people evaluate participation, responsibility, and personal cost. Structural changes do not reverse easily because they are rooted in experience rather than opinion. When men step back and reassess their lives, many discover something they were never encouraged to prioritize before. Stability is not found in constant striving. Peace is not found in endless negotiation. Fulfillment is not found in being endlessly available. These realizations do not come from ideology, they come from lived reality. For years, many men believed that endurance alone would eventually be rewarded, that if they kept showing up, kept giving, kept sacrificing, things would balance out. When that balance never arrived, a quiet recalibration began. Expectations were lowered, commitments were reduced, energy was redirected. This redirection is not chaotic, it is methodical. Men simplify because complexity carries risk. They reduce exposure because uncertainty is costly. They invest inward Because external validation proved unreliable. This inward investment changes everything. Once a man builds a life that functions without constant approval, he becomes difficult to manipulate. Fear loses its grip. Shame loses its power. Pressure becomes background noise rather than a command. This is why attempts to reassert control through moral arguments or emotional appeals fail. They target vulnerabilities that no longer exist. The leverage is gone. The broader society struggles with this because it was built on the assumption that certain behaviors were permanent. That assumption shaped policies, markets, and cultural narratives. When behavior changes, those systems wobble. The response so far has been confusion mixed with resistance. Confusion because the shift does not fit existing frameworks. Resistance because adapting requires admitting that some long held beliefs were flawed. But reality does not pause for comfort, it moves forward regardless of whether narratives keep up. The men who have already disengaged are not waiting for permission to live differently. They are already doing so. They are building routines around health, finances, and personal development. They are prioritizing rest over recognition. They are choosing predictability over promise. This does not make them perfect. It makes them honest with themselves. What often goes unacknowledged is how much emotional labor men were performing quietly for decades, absorbing stress, mediating conflict, suppressing frustration, being strong by default. When that labor stops, the absence is felt. But absence is not abandonment, it is boundary setting. Boundaries force systems to adapt. They reveal dependencies that were hidden. They expose imbalances that were normalized. In this sense, men walking away is not destructive, it is corrective. It forces recalibration. It highlights what was unsustainable. And the uncomfortable part is that correction often feels like loss to those who benefited from imbalance. That feeling fuels backlash. But backlash does not restore what no longer works. The future will not resemble the past simply because some people want it to. It will resemble whatever arrangements prove stable under pressure. Stability is emerging in smaller, quieter forms, localized communities, selective partnerships, clear agreements, reduced expectations. These are not glamorous, but they are durable. Durability matters more than appearance when conditions are uncertain. Large scale narratives will eventually adjust to reflect this reality, but they will lag behind behavior. That lag creates friction. Friction creates noise. Noise obscures understanding. Clarity cuts through noise. The clarity here is simple. People participate when participation makes sense. When it does not, they stop. Men did not collectively decide to disengage. They individually reached the same conclusion. That conclusion was shaped by repeated patterns: effort without return, responsibility without authority, expectation without appreciation. Over time, patterns become lessons. Lessons change behavior. Once behavior changes at scale, it becomes culture. Culture will eventually normalize what now feels disruptive. Future generations will grow up with different assumptions. Participation will be negotiated rather than assumed. Roles will be chosen rather than assigned. This transition will be uncomfortable. Many transitions are. But discomfort is not collapse, it is adjustment. The real risk lies in refusing to adjust, in clinging to outdated expectations while conditions change. That path leads to resentment, not resolution. Resolution requires acknowledging autonomy on all sides. It requires understanding that cooperation cannot be forced. It must be built. Men who have walked away are not unreachable. They are simply unwilling to return to systems that ignore their experience. If conditions change, some will re engage, but they will do so on new terms, terms that prioritize respect, reciprocity, and reality. Until then, they will continue building lives that function independently, lives that require less explanation, lives that are quieter but more stable. This is why panic is misplaced. What is happening is not disappearance, it is redistribution of energy. Energy moving away from conflict and toward control. Control over time, control over resources, control over attention. Once people experience control, they rarely surrender it lightly. The question facing society is not how to force participation, but how to create environments where participation is genuinely attractive again. That is a harder task than issuing demands, but it is the only one that works. At the individual level, the lesson is equally clear. No one owes unlimited access to their energy. No one is required to sacrifice peace to maintain appearances. Walking away from what harms you is not failure, it is discernment. As the world becomes more volatile, discernment will matter more than ever. We are entering an era where simplicity outperforms excess, where stability outperforms status, where clarity outperforms chaos. Men who recognize this early are already adapting. Others will follow in time. This does not mean relationships will disappear. It means they will be fewer, more intentional, and more grounded. It means cooperation will be based on alignment rather than obligation. That shift may feel unsettling now, but it may ultimately produce healthier outcomes for everyone involved. As we close this conversation, the most important takeaway is not blame, it is understanding. Understanding why this shift occurred, understanding why it persists, understanding why it will not reverse through pressure alone. If you want engagement, you must make engagement worthwhile. If you want cooperation, you must offer respect. If you want stability, you must design for sustainability. Those principles apply everywhere, not just here. Now I want to hear from you. What did you think about what was discussed in this video? Do you agree with the observations and conclusions, or do you see things differently? Leave a comment and share your thoughts because these conversations matter and they shape what comes next. Like the video if you like it. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you like the video, share the video. And just remember that all roads lead to MWA, men walking away, and cheers.
Nothing says you care like crypto. Nothing can compare. Nothing says you care like crypto. Oh, nothing can compare to crypto.